Okay, my dear friend. Thank you very much, William, for coming again. I think we already had like 7 episodes. I have to make sure. Yes. So it's always a great pleasure to have you. And today you're going to speak about the Swedish anti-family model. And the floor is yours, as usual. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you for having me. And I ask you once again to fire me if I'm with you too long or whatever. I don't want to overstay my welcome. I am enjoying
You're always welcome.
Thank you. Well, I am enjoying our chats together. I feel it's important to help people understand what has happened to their societies in modern times. And when I go back to my own book, The War Against the Family, and I don't say this to pat myself on the back, I say it to reflect upon how little has changed, and except for the fact that how things have got so much more extreme and how we've all gotten used to it. You know, there's that story people tell about the frog in the pot of water. You put the frog in the pot of water and you start to turn up the heat very slowly. And if you're slow enough, the frog, who is always free to jump out, never jumps out. And he ends up getting boiled to death because the temperature went up so gradually, he just never noticed the difference from one moment to the next and didn't know what to do about the situation. So he just died there. I'm not saying we're all going to die because of what's going on in our countries. But I do think these gradual policy changes are something we need to be attuned to, which is why I'm happy to be on your show and chatting with people about this. I'm going to be reading little bits from The War Against the Family and also just freelance chatting about them as we go along. It's a short chapter, so I don't know how long we're going to be, but that doesn't matter. I want to just start off with the first sentence of this chapter. In the context of Canada, for example, we had a Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. His son is now the Prime Minister, which itself is an interesting topic, by the way. There's a lot of these democratic nations which end up with family members or relatives or very close friends succeeding each other in power. In Canada case, this is a father-son situation. And when Pierre Trudeau, the father, was walking around Canada talking to newspapers about what he wanted to do with our country, and I stress he wanted to do something with our country, he had policy ambitions, and he saw public policy and social policy as instruments which would be useful to him in changing the country. Sweden was his model. I remember him talking to newspaper reporters and saying, Sweden is the middle way. What do you mean, Mr. Prime Minister? Well, he said, we don't want communism. Everyone's, that's been done. And the result has been terrible. When he was Prime Minister, by the way, communism had not yet fallen. But it fell just before my War Against the Family book came out. And I'm happy. Well, I'm unhappy to say. I'm happy to say I predicted the fall, that it would fall from within, which it did. At any rate, Trudeau was walking around saying that Sweden's the middle way. We have communism, which is an option, but we don't want that. It's too totalitarian. We don't want vulgar American capitalism. We don't want that because it's too vulgar, too greedy, too whatever, every man for himself, all that sort of thinking. What we should strive for is Sweden, which is the middle way between these two extreme alternatives. And so he set out to fashion Canada in that way. And I don't know if you're familiar with the newspaper, the Epoch Times, but I write for them on occasion. And just 10 days ago, I published an article with them, which I'm proud to say is an important article about what it is that Pierre Trudeau did to our country to change it in the direction he wanted it to go. The essay that I wrote is called, it's about Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the essay is called The Charter at 40, How Canada Got Recolonized. Recolonized? What are you talking about? Well, I was talking about what Trudeau did with his charter. He more or less muscled it into existence, not all by himself, but he was the main force behind it. And the idea was that he was going to impose a Charter of Rights and Freedoms on Canada and fight back against what he saw as the piecework system that we had, with laws that changed province to province or that weren't the same all across the country. He called it checkerboard federalism, and he hated it because it was a bottom-up system on the British model, and he thought that we should have a more Cartesian type of system from the top down, and he wanted Canada to be more socialistic. And he had a kind of Machiavellian genius, because initially he was discouraged by the fact that Canada's own constitution has a division of powers between the federal government at the top and each of the 10 provinces. So they have their own provincial powers. And according to our constitution, the federal powers and the provincial powers should not be mixed up. They should not mess with each other. The federal government was forbidden, for example, to intrude into any of our 10 provinces and start regulating things like medical care, which were listed as the responsibility of the provinces. So Trudeau didn't know what to do. But then he had this Machiavellian moment where he said to himself, in a sense, a federation is weaker than a centralized nation because it has these different levels of law for different jurisdictions. So maybe we can just pick them off one by one. It was the way his mind was working. And this way, he said, we can install socialism in every province, one by one, instead of all at once. And that's kind of how he set about it. But the first thing that he had to do was to disempower our legislators. Now, how did he do that? He did it by imposing a document on Canada called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which lists all the various rights and freedoms the people are supposed to have. However, the language of the Charter is incredibly abstract. For example, it says we all have a right to equality, but no one knows what it means, and it wasn't spelled out in the Charter. So guess who had to interpret what equality means, or liberty, or any of these other high-sounding concepts in the Charter? Well, the courts. The courts had to decide. So suddenly all of Canada's legislators became subordinated to the courts in terms of their judgments, and they got infantilized. And I'm sorry I'm going on too long about this, but it's an interesting kind of story, because when Canada was a colony, it was subordinated to the judges in Great Britain, in England, because we were an English colony. And so nothing could be done of a legal nature without the permission of a British judge. Well, Canadians fought hard to get their own constitution going, and they did. So in a sense, they broke free of colonization, and their legislators created what was called the supreme law of the land. That, just like in Britain, legislation in the British House of Commons is the supreme law of England, because Britain has no written constitution, doesn't have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But Trudeau was mainly French in his formation, and he thought Canada should have a more French-style government, which means a code law. And so his charter was a type of code law, and he imposed it on Canada. And in that way, he recolonized our nation, because he made our legislators subordinate to our judges. So Canada is now a kind of bureaucracy. It's run by the high courts. Now, of course, we make laws, but you better believe there's no legislator in Canada that will even dare to make a law that he feels the judges will shoot down or question or reject. So the first thing legislators say to each other is, what are the judges going to say if we do this? What are the judges going to say if we do that? So in that sense, Canada's parliament has been infantilized. So between being recolonized and parliament infantilized, you see, this all came out of the notion of a kind of supposedly highly rational Cartesian style Charter of Rights and Freedoms imposed on our country. I'm sorry to go on so long about that, but it's been on my mind. Mind lately.
Yeah, William, it's very important that you're speaking about that, because this is one of the main issues our friend here, JJ, is talking about, the kingdom of men and the institutions of men. And it's very interesting that you just said that Canada fought off the British just to find themselves given their rights by consent to a new leader, this time, what's his name, Trudeau? And he established the recolonization of Canada, like you described it so well. And now his son is bringing that to the verge of a totalitarian regime already. So
yes.
It's very interesting when we, distance ourselves from the kingdom of God and we put our trust in men. Never mind if you have a constitution or not, you eventually find yourself with no rights.
Well, I think that's correct. Now, here's the paradox, and I'm going to say it's a paradox about Sweden too, which we'll get to in a minute, is that Canadians love their Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you ask any Canadian, what do you think of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? They'll say it's fantastic. It's wonderful. If you ask them if they've ever read any of it, even one word, and if they're honest, they'll say, no, I haven't. I've never read it. Well, then if you haven't read it, how come you think it's so fantastic? Well, everybody should have their rights and freedoms defended, don't you think? That sort of thing. So they're completely unaware. They're completely unaware of what's happened to their country.
But do you personally think that our rights are coming from some man with a pen writing on a piece of paper something? Or it's more like just a description of gods that we should have if we are standing our position with conviction in God?
In God, did you say?
Yes.
Yes, well, I have a lot of time for God. I hope he has some time for me. But when it comes to rights, Jeremy Bentham wrote a very interesting essay. I think it came to light about 1837, but he actually wrote it in the 1790s after the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Now, this interests me too, and I'm trying to get up the energy to write an article comparing the French Declaration of Rights with the American Declaration of Independence and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because they all differ in many important respects. And if you permit me, I'll just say a brief word about how they differ. Well, the Americans were first. Actually, the British were first during the Glorious Revolution, but I'm going to leave them for now and talk about the American Declaration of Independence and their Bill of Rights. What the Americans were trying to do was to create a constitution and a set of rights for Americans. They didn't want, and by the way, this is all very confused in the minds of the public, because people talk about the American Revolution, but it wasn't a revolution. It was a war of independence. The American colonists were not revolting against British values. They were revolting against judges and politicians who wouldn't give them those values, which they had inherited as far as they were concerned, and which were part of their lives as British subjects of the crown. And so when they revolted against the British government, they weren't revolting against the crown. They figured the crown was their last security for their rights. They were revolting against politicians who were taxing them without representation and all that sort of thing. And a lot of people know the story about the Boston Tea Party and the various revolts against this. So the American Declaration and the Bill of Rights was basically a document defending the rights of Americans. It wasn't written for all mankind. And also, they were primarily negative rights. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, not all of them, but and I'm no expert in this. I'm just giving you what I've learned so far. And that is that they were negative rights. They basically were statements about what the government should not and cannot do to you. Now, of course, that's a bit false in the sense that any government which grabs the machine guns and climbs in the tanks can do whatever it wants to you. But the pious hope was, and the thrust of the documents, all the Bill of Rights and the Declaration, which were declarations of so-called natural rights, which I will come to in a moment also, that phrase, they were negative. They were basically warning the state and the government, get your foot off my neck. And that is still the posture of most Americans. And interestingly, when people ask me, how would you describe an American versus a Canadian? And by the way, a lot of the Canadian temperament was formed by people we still call British Empire loyalists. They were people who were loyal to Britain, did not want to go along with the American War of Independence, and they came to Canada. Nobody knows how many, but we know for sure at least 50,000 of them, maybe 100,000. No one's ever kept a record, but it was a lot. And they were of a specific temperament themselves. They did not want to revolt against the government, and they were happy with whatever rights they had. But the American revolutionists, as they're called, as I say, it was a war of independence, not a revolution. They wanted those negative rights enforced and, get your foot off my neck. When France came to its own revolution, only 11 years later, right, from August 1789, when they put together their own Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, note the language. It was not the rights of French people. It was the rights of man, capital M. Now, people object to you using that word these days because they haven't got any idea at all about the origin of the word, but it comes from the German Mann, like das Mann, and the whole sense of a human being. And so the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was also not about the subject. The French had a monarch, but they didn't talk about subjects of the monarch. They talked about the rights of man and of the citizen. Who was the citizen in the French mode of thinking at the time? The citizen was someone who joined with all other citizens in the formation of what Rousseau called the general will. And you'll find it in my article, by the way, in Epoch Times. A very interesting distinction between la volonté générale, as they say in French, and majority opinion, or the national will. And Canada's own Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, when he was trying to figure out how to back up the British system of government and impose a kind of unified form of government on Canada, he didn't understand really the difference between a national will and the general will either. And I'll just explain to your listeners what it is. A national will, for example, can be as little as, say, 50% plus one vote. And let me not get into the paradox of that, by the way, because democracy is full of disarming paradoxes, and that's one of them. Because if you have two parties, say a house, a legislature, and you have exactly equal number of legislatures on each side of the house, and you have decided that 50% plus one vote is going to make the law real, or it's going to reject the law, that means one person can walk across the floor and change the whole nation. So it's not really a majority at all, it's that one person. Because if he walks across the floor to your side and makes your side the winner, then he goes, oh, gee, there's something I never thought of. And he walks back to the other side again, he changes it back to the other side. So here you have one person swinging the whole nation. So 50% plus one is actually a very tenuous way to run a country. The other real weakness of democratic theory, in my opinion, is the fact that the vote of a fool always cancels the vote of a wise man. And there are more fools than there are wise men in any society. So democracy as a system, for the two reasons I've just explained, is very weak in terms of arriving somehow at the good life, the good society. But I think it's Churchill who said, it may be bad, but it's better than all the other systems that have been tried from time to time. At any rate, when the French came along, they wanted, and I'm quoting, they wanted to legislate, quote, for all mankind, unquote. They weren't interested in just legislating for the French. They wanted their declaration to be for all mankind. And it's an extraordinarily abstract document from that point of view. And I mentioned Jeremy Bentham, who was a key utilitarian thinker in the 18th century, who saw this declaration and he read it. And he wrote a little essay. I just got it last week and read it myself. It's only about 6 or 7 pages. And it's called, the title of it is Anarchical Fallacies. So anarchical like in anarchy. So anarchical fallacies. And the first fallacy he put his finger on was the word rights. Natural rights, which is in all these documents. It's like some kind of magic incantation. But he said, first of all, he said, there's no such thing as a natural right. Because any right for one man implies an obligation on another. So there's no such thing as a right which does not generate an obligation. Somebody has to provide the right or enforce the right for the person who's demanding it. And the only way that can happen is in a society of laws. In other words, a society that's already fully formed and has a system of law that can actually enforce rights, so-called rights. So he saw rights as not natural at all, but extraordinarily artificial, sustained only by a system of law, which enables them to become effective if they are to be effective. And I think there are obviously lots of cases in which it's important for rights to be defended. Yeah.
If I may ask, why it doesn't make any sense for me, because, for example, the right to speak or the right of movement or the right of gathering is not an obligation on someone else. It's just something that we have to protect ourselves with conviction and to act it out.
Well, I don't think he was talking about your capacity to speak. You can walk out in the forest and speak all you want. But a lot of the rights which were being demanded in these documents implied the necessity of someone to enforce them. For example, I have a 28-acre property here, which I love. Last summer, I saw someone come out of the forest on the other side of my property, and they walked right across the grass in front of the house, 3 people actually, and my wife was more outspoken than me. She said, "Excuse me, this is private property," because they were walking through it like it was a public park. And they basically stuck up the middle finger to us and kept on walking through and left and so on. But I realized at the time, my right to private property is an enforceable claim. And if it's not an enforceable claim, it's just an abstraction. It doesn't mean anything. If I can call the police and have them come and throw those people off, then my right is an enforceable claim. But otherwise, it's just words. You can call it natural if you want.
But it is a principle. Whether or not you are going to force it, it's a different question. You can hire someone to protect your land. You can actually use your gun. I think it would be a little too much of an overreaction. But the principle is what matters. Whether or not you are forcing it is a different question.
Yeah, I think we're arguing about the difference between a natural right and an enforceable legal right. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think private property is very important in free societies, and I think it's a right that needs to be defended. But it's basically an enforceable claim. It's a claim being made by you as the owner of the property against all others. They have an obligation to respect your right. And if they don't respect your right and you have no means of defending it, then it doesn't mean anything.
I understand. But I'm just saying that I think that rights are not enforced but exercised, and we have to exercise that to protect
we agree, but we need a couple of beers together to really go over this.
Yeah, I steal all of that information from JJ, my friend, by the way. Yeah. So would you like to...
Should I talk about Sweden a bit?
Yes. But maybe before you go to Sweden, maybe you can just say a few sentences about what I asked you earlier, like how to describe to a woman who completely lost her mind, not realizing the importance of family. Like, how would you tell her, like, hey, wake up. This is a huge problem. You need a family. You need to actually be a mother. That's a beautiful thing. If you can say a few things about that before we go into the Swedish question.
Well, yes. Here I come over to your side more on the question of what's natural and what's not. The French have an expression that they borrowed from the Romans, I suppose, because it exists in Latin too, although I forget the Latin. The French expression goes like this: chasser la nature, elle revient en quatre pattes, which means you chase nature out the door and she comes back on all fours, like a natural animal. So, in other words, nature cannot really be suppressed ultimately. And so the woman you're talking about, I mean, in a free society, you can say she can do whatever she wants. But if she follows her own nature, she's probably going to want a sexual life. She's probably going to want children and all that sort of thing. Very few do not. And now we're getting into a whole area of, what is nature? How does it work? Why do we have such strong, for example, sexual feelings, such strong feelings of love for people of the opposite sex and all that sort of thing? I certainly do. So let me segue into the Swedish thing because this is actually at the root of what the Swedes were fighting. And I'll just give you I'm going to read a sentence from the very first page of this chapter. Sweden is the clearest example we have of a non-communist country that was purposely changed by its governing elite from a strongly traditional family-based society, which is what the people wanted in those days, into an egalitarian anti-family welfare state, which is what the radical elite wanted. And they did this in less than half a century. And of course, we were warned about this. And the fact that it happened in the West in a non-totalitarian and incredibly thorough way, the way it has in Sweden, is interesting. Sweden is not like other European countries. In fact, you could say it's not really a European country. It's a northern Scandinavian country. I forget the actual roots, but I'm going to recommend a book by a British man his name is Roland Huntford. Here it is. This book is called The New Totalitarians by Roland Huntford. I read it over again last week. This is 30 years after I read it the first time. It's not stale. Almost everything in it that he feared and predicted, and that Sweden promised it would do, has come to pass. And any of the numbers or statistics in his book, and there aren't very many, they're mostly philosophical, moral, and ideological arguments. The situation has only gotten more extreme than it was then, with some ups and downs along the way. Sweden tends to vacillate from time to time, according to the parties that take power. But at the time he wrote his book, the Democrats party in Sweden had been in power for almost 40 years. And they had in mind changing Sweden entirely from the bottom up and the top down. From the top down, it would be by policy. From the bottom up, it would be by action through the schools, through public shame. For example, shaming you if you were a woman who didn't want to go out into the market and work. You just wanted to stay home and raise your kids. would bring shame on you, that creating the environment for that. So they really went after it. And it was really, I would say, organized most prominently by Gunnar and Alva Myrdal. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. I'm pretty sure of that. She may have won a Nobel Prize too. I don't know, but he was an economist, and she was a radical feminist socialist. And as a team with their buddies, they decided to change Sweden thoroughly from what it had been to what it is today. And their policies became much more openly egalitarian, much more openly socialist. And Alva in particular campaigned vigorously for the idea of equality, not as the right to compete on equal terms, for example, but in favor of inequality of results or outcomes. And I'm quoting her, the gradual reduction of the differences in conditions of life. No longer was the family unit to be favored in any way. On the contrary, Sweden quickly became the first non-Marxist state to militate openly against the traditional family in its political, economic, and social policies. Here I'm quoting her again. All adults, in her words, were to be treated in the same manner by society, whether they lived alone or in some sort of common living arrangement, unquote. And by the way, Sweden today, if you're talking about people living alone, has the very highest number of adult citizens who live alone. I think in Stockholm, the figure is something like 60% of all Swedes who live in Stockholm live alone. So it's become a lonely society in that way. But the family unit, in her view, was not to be, and I'm using her word again, favored. Not to be favored in any way. It was actually targeted for destruction by political, economic, and social policies. The Myrdals, the two of them, wrote a report in 1934. So this is going back, 90 years. The report was called The Crisis in the Population Question. And it was all about, it called for the economic independence of married partners as a basic condition of equality, by which they meant the focus on future social policy would discourage traditional family interdependence. The family unit, they said, must be disintegrated, their word, into individual units with a dependence on the state. So today, and this was written in 1993, but it's only gotten worse. Today, fully 60% of Swedish women who work full-time and 45% of those who work part-time work for the state. So their views were brought to bear on changing Sweden, and this came about with this astonishing speed. In a startling statement published in 1968 by the Swedish Institute, which was considered a promoter of quasi-official Swedish views, under the heading, quote, "The family is not sacred," unquote. So that's the heading of their statement. Here's the statement. "I should like to abolish the family as a means of earning a livelihood. Let adults be economically independent of each other and give society a large share of responsibility for its children. In such a society, we could very well do without marriage as a legal entity," unquote. So that was published as policy statement in 1968. So the only thing you can admire about these people is they weren't hiding it. They were all up front, and their words and thoughts and policy initiatives have been copied by other radical leftists, egalitarians, mostly of a feminist nature, male or female, in the West. Here's this Canadian feminist named Mary O'Brien. She says the most remarkable achievement of feminism is the breakdown of the family. And she ends her long quote with these words: "The nuclear family is a goner." And she was happy about it, you see. So down with patriarchy, down with economic dependency of the woman on the man. Let them all be independent out in the market economy and looking after themselves. So this is the kind of society that she was pushing for. Swedish politicians and policymakers eagerly embraced this new coercive idea of what equality was to mean, a cynical justification for transforming the classical liberal notion of government from an institution that sets the rules for free people, but never played the game, to one that sets the rules, plays the game, and then handicaps all those who refuse to play the same way. So government, as I said here, enters into the game, plays the game, sets the rules, and punishes people who won't play by those rules. This is the beginning, really, of what I think of as democratic tyranny in the West. No machine guns, no jackboots, but certainly coercive democratic policy. And by the way, economically, it's interesting because a lot of the states that try this, and Sweden has been, if you want to say, very successful in its efforts to do this, for reasons particular to Sweden. It didn't have the same kind of feudal history that other European nations had. And so in a sense, it had a much more pliant and compliant population, and more willing to go on to embrace these policies. And so you don't get a lot of the pushback in Sweden that you might say in a country like Canada or the USA or Britain, where people tried these things. I'm just going to give you now a sense of some of the consequences of these changes. One of them is taxation. I think today, as far as free nations go, of the world go, the Swedes still pay the highest taxes of any people on earth. In 1985, the top income tax rate was 72%. It was recently cut to 50%, and I said this in 1993. But, this goes up and down. But if you look at the world studies on taxation, and I'm talking now about all taxation, not just income taxation, you'll find the Swedes are incredibly heavy taxed, and a lot of them don't mind it. A lot of them have the attitude of, well, look, it's a great life. Government's doing things pretty well. We have a great life here, and we'd pay more tax if you asked us to. That kind of attitude. So they don't have the attitude of, say, Henry Thoreau, that famous American colonist who got so upset with the government that he retired from society, and he built himself a cabin on Walden Pond in Massachusetts, I think it was. And someone asked him, what do you think the best kind of government is? And he said, the best government is the least government. And this became kind of an American attitude. It welled up through the literature and the folk talk. Let us be independent. Let us make our own way in life. And the best government is the least. And by the way, earlier I was talking about national temperaments, and I didn't finish by telling you that because of the rebellion of the Americans against their masters, their British masters, and because of the experience they had in opening the country, the Wild West, I often say that inside every American is a frontiersman, but inside every Canadian is a little policeman. And I think that comes out in situations like COVID. My daughter, who has not had the vaccine and refuses it for lots of reasons, one of them is medical, but also philosophical. She has been thinking of moving her whole family to Texas for a year until the Canadians get over their police policies about the jab. And I said, why Texas? She said, because everybody's living normally down there. The schools are open, the restaurants are open. Everybody's just, living a normal life and not here, which just underlines what I was saying about inside every Canadian is a little policeman. And it comes out in these kinds of situations. I think Ontario, the province where I live, is the most draconian and strictest province in Canada, probably the most strict jurisdiction in North America. Anyway, back to the Swedes and taxation. What you tend to find in these socialist empires is very high tax rates, and it's very scary because in the world of free enterprise, in the business world, if a business goes bankrupt, it has to close its doors and go through all those procedures. But a country can go bankrupt without closing its doors. All it has to do is agree to keep taxing future generations for services that they're never going to receive to pay for today's services. And I think this is one of the great moral ruptures of any socialistic system, is that it breaks the moral bond between the generations. We should be spending enough money to support ourselves and hopefully improve the world we live in for the children who come after us. We shouldn't be spending their money, which is what happens when we tax them to pay debts. After all, what is a government debt? It's a form of deferred taxation. That's all it is. So, and Canada has massive government debt now. I don't think we're ever going to pay it off. And Trudeau Sr. started it to get his French-style empire into action. When he came into power, Canada, after 100 years of existence, had, I think, $20 million of national debt. By the time he finished government 14 years later, we had $20 billion. By the time he finished government 14 years later, we had $200 billion. And if you add the rate of interest to that over the intervening years since he left government, you get the $600 or $700 or $800 billion that we have today, whatever. So, how does he justify imposing those costs on future generations who are not here to defend themselves against the appetites of the government or the population, for that matter? So,
William, before Sweden became so socialist, I think it had like a very strong capitalistic policies in the 50s, which helped them to create a great wealth, which will eventually allow those glitchers to come and build it on top of on society. Am I correct about that?
You're talking about Sweden?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they were. In fact, some Swedes will argue that they're still a very capitalist society. By the way, I don't like the word capitalism. It's got a bad name, so I don't use it. All entities of any kind of productive nature use capital, especially governments. Governments are hungry for capital. That's why they tax the hell out of us, so they can accumulate lots of capital and do what they want to do. The phrase we should be using is free enterprise, because that's what distinguishes what independent, free people, private people do with business and all the rest of it. It's free enterprise. Whereas government, of course, government is not. It's coerced.
Yes.
It's coerced activity. And by the way, if you just want to see where a country's going, just look at the differences over the last 30 or 40 years between the average cost of housing, food, and taxation. There's another one in there. I've forgotten what it is, but in Canada, what I call total taxation, which is not just income tax. You got to add all the invisible taxes, gasoline taxes, alcohol taxes, food taxes. I mean, there are hundreds of ways in which the government's dinging you for tax every time you turn around. If you add all that up and you're honest about the reporting, you're going to see that what happens in all these countries that go socialist, and that's what Canada's done, of the four items I just mentioned, food, clothing, taxation, and I forget the fourth one, but there's four of them, main ones.
Even licensing.
Taxation, which used to be the lowest of them all, has increased at a much higher percentage than all the others. Like, for example, since the mid-'60s, housing in Canada has gone up like, I think 1,200% since the mid-'60s or something like that. I have to pick the number right now because it's not in front of me, but I'm pretty close. Clothing's gone up 870%, that kind of thing. But taxation's gone up 2,300% in that same period. So when taxation becomes the biggest household expense, visible and invisible, you know where the country's going. See, it's becoming Swedenized.
So it's taxation and inflation, because the prices are going up because we are losing our purchasing power in the same time while paying taxation.
You are correct, but when I quoted those percentage increases, it took inflation out of it. That's in constant dollars. Wow. So it's even more scary, you see.
It is.
What are some consequences of what Sweden has done for Sweden itself, and I think for any country that follows suit? So I say here, with Sweden as our guide to the future, we had best gird our loins for the coming family decline, or else resolve to resist and remove the policies that are its cause. Now, here's just a handful of them. Sweden, I think I mentioned this already, is the world's most apartment-oriented society. As of 1980, fully 33% of all households in Sweden contained only one person, and 63% of the residents of Stockholm lived alone. I said 60%. I was off. That was 30 years ago. Who knows? Maybe I haven't done the recent research, but it's probably well over that today, And when it comes to things like religion, well, I suppose this is true of England too, I don't know, but the Swedes took over the Lutheran Church. It is state-owned, as in Norway and in Germany, and its employees are civil servants. I couldn't resist the humor here where I said, this is like taking communion from a tax collector. At any rate, Sweden, nevertheless, is the most atheistic democracy on earth. In 1983, only 27% of Swedes said they took any strength from religion, and only 5% attended church of any kind, compared, say, to Americans, where the figures were 80% who took strength in religion and 40% who attended church. Canada's another matter. I won't bother quoting. I think it was 60% of Canadians. Sweden also developed many of the social and tax policies specifically designed to attack parental rights in the nuclear family. The state particularly and specifically intervenes in family life. In 1981, for example, the Finnish authorities from Finland took 552 children from their parents for reported child abuse, in quotes. But the very same year in Sweden, which is only had a population 3 times larger than Finland, the authorities took 22,000 children from their families. And they got criticized internationally on the grounds that this action was itself abuse of another variety, state control of the families. At any rate, here's another thing which has got to make you stop and think. Sweden is the first Western nation to have the majority of its voters dependent on public funds, and thus beholden to the hand that feeds them. Sweden has the lowest marriage rate in the Western world and the highest, get this, they don't talk about divorce. They don't talk about divorce because so few are actually getting married. They talk about couple dissolution. And now I got that term from a wonderful book written by a man named David Popenoe, an American sociologist. And I ordered his book before I wrote mine. His book was called disturbing the nest. And a lot of it was about the Swedish problem. And so last week I said to myself, I wonder where he is and if he's still around and still doing this kind of thing. Maybe I can get an update from him. Anyway, I emailed him at his old email address, which is 30 some odd years old. And lo and behold, he answered me. And I asked him how he's doing. He said, well, I'm 88 now. And guess where he's living? He's living in Sweden. And here's the guy who wrote the book critiquing Sweden, but now he's living in Sweden. He shook his head. He said, only because my daughter's been living here for 25 years. She married a Swede. So I come to visit her, he said, for a month or so at a time. And you know what he said? Life here is incredibly pleasant. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, they've gotten so used to it. Most of them don't mind the fact that the government's running everything. And their only concern is it's got to do a good job of it, and so on. So you see, you get this situation where through government policy and intrusion into private life, you can end private life almost totally, except for individuals who will run off and live alone if they want to and be very comfortable. And when they want something other than that, they go get it from a government organization. Government daycare for their child, government schools for their school-age children. They get government subsidized housing for young married couples. They get government subsidized old age homes for the old when they get old, or they stick their parents in them. By the way, that's one of the reasons the COVID numbers were so bad for Sweden initially, is because whereas in Canada, say, an old age home, there's one down the street from me somewhere, I don't know, a few miles away, it's probably got about 20 or 30 residents in it. But the Swedish ones are massive. They could have 500, 600, 700 senior citizens living in these same complexes. And so when COVID hit, they all got hit at once. And so Sweden had huge numbers of COVID-infected seniors initially. At any rate, what I'm getting at here is you're going from a vertical type of situation where you have grandparents, parents, children, private home, independent schools, independent churches, and all that kind of stuff, to the, let's call it the horizontalization of society, where everything happens in levels. Like I said, daycare for the little guys, schools for the young students, public universities for the older students, subsidized housing for the young marrieds, and who knows what else for the older married couples, and then subsidized old age homes for the very old. And that's how you end up, and I've mentioned this before in this show, I think, with what one economist called economic churning. What is economic churning? Well, it's a situation where the woman who there's a woman who comes to someone's house to look after her children while she goes to work. And where's she going to work? She's going to work in the old age home where the first woman's mother is being kept. So, they're paying each other to do things that they could have done for themselves, but they're not. Instead, the state is doing it, and there's what they call economic churning activity is taking place. So I think in the end, a lot of the money that's being taken from citizens when they're young and they're working is being filtered through the government's hands. Of course, the government takes its piece of the action along the way to support itself, and then being poured back into the same families along the way as they age and get older and so on. The money goes back in the form of government expenses and services. And by the way, one of the things that the Swedes did to help destroy the nuclear family was to end joint tax returns. That's what we call them here. What's a joint tax return? It's where a husband, I'm picking a number here, say he earns $100,000 a year. He declares himself to have earned $50,000, and he attributes the other 50 to his wife. And he sends in both their tax returns, and they get taxed at a lower level because she's doing the work of looking after the children. in the home. It sounds like a really good idea to me. And it was designed, when it was brought into play, it was designed to promote in-home care of children. But what the Swedes did immediately was they attacked this. In 1971, the Swedish tax law was, they call it reformed, I would say radicalized, to prohibit joint taxation, so that the woman who wanted to be, quote, their language, just a housewife, notice the pejorative use of language, oh, you're just a housewife, right? As if that was something easy. Anybody who's ever tried it will know how difficult it is to do. Was it a real financial? Huh?
I'm just saying, this is the hardest job in the universe.
No kidding. Ask any man who's tried it for a little while, especially with 4 or 5 kids running around, half of them in diapers, and all the rest of it. It is widely believed, here we go, I'm quoting, it is widely believed that the prohibition of joint taxation was a turning point in the gender equality issue in Sweden. Dr. Eric Brodin, he's a native of Sweden, says the Swedish government views mothers, listen to this, I mean, it almost makes me weep. It views mothers who do not work outside the home as parasites. Swedish language.
Can you repeat it, please?
It views mothers who do not work outside the home as parasites. Wow. In other words, they're living off others, is the idea. Shame on them. Well, these are very powerful social forces. When you start talking about an honest mother who's trying to raise her own children as a parasite, she's going to be looking over her shoulder. In short, through the manipulation of tax policy by radical politicians and bureaucrats, the state succeeded in subsidizing family breakdown. And this breakdown, by the way, at the time was by no means desired by the masses of Swedes, but they get used to it. In fact, the Swedish government gets irate, used to get irate, don't know what they do today. But as I say, almost all of this is still holds. It's just a little worse today. And they got irate that fathers were as yet reluctant to take the generous paid 1 year, quote, parental leave, which they call it. They noticed that only 5% of Swedish fathers actually took the parental leave. So the state was now considering requiring them to do so. Now, I refer to this as coercive humanitarianism. It's the idea that the state has some kind of humanitarian objective for all citizens, but when the citizens naturally, remember the quote I gave you about chasing nature out the door and she comes back on all fours, when citizens naturally don't want to do that, they begin to force them. For in Sweden, it's quoting again, family policy is seen as a tool that can be used by the government to try to change the traditional division of labor between the sexes. Here, listen to this. The idea of free choice in the matter was more or less abandoned. So here you have liberty of individual citizens being sacrificed for the coercive humanitarian policies of the government, because the government wants everyone to live in this state-certified lifestyle. Which brings me to the German poet Goethe. Goethe said, I'm quoting, "And no one is more of a slave than he who imagines himself to be free without being free," unquote. See, that's the worst slave of all. He imagines himself to be free when he's not free.
William, there was no resistance against those policies?
Some Swedes left Sweden, but most of them just caved in and went along with it because most of these things are offered to them as free, right? Free, tax funded. They get used to the idea that someone else is paying for this. For some people who aren't producing anything themselves, that's true. Someone else is paying for it. But for anyone who's productive, it's ridiculous. You're paying for it.
How can they perpetuate this system I mean, the debt there is not exploding. Like, how do they keep their lifestyle for so many years under this social construct?
I'll tell you, one of the ways they do it is through sex and other bodily satisfaction of as many individual bodily appetites as possible. And that's what Canada has done as well. And that's why it confuses some people, but it shouldn't. If people ask me, I have a very dear friend who keeps telling me that we need to go back to our liberal democratic ideals. And I say, are you kidding? We're so far beyond that, it's not even funny. What do you mean? He said. I said, well, Canada is now a libertarian socialist country. What do you mean by that? What a strange phrase. I said, well, it's not so strange. What basically happened was freedom wasn't enough, because when we were boasting about liberal democracy and the value of freedom, we found that nevertheless an underclass was growing in our midst. We had all kinds of poor people, all kinds of hungry people, all kinds of uneducated people, blah, 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 blah. And this was true of every democracy in the Western world. It was embarrassing because they rested on the foundation of liberty, and yet freedom obviously wasn't doing the job totally. It became almost a joke amongst left-wingers. Well, you talk about freedom all you want. Look at your society. It's falling apart. Crime in the streets, uneducated people running around. That's what freedom is bringing you. Well, so something had to be done. So without giving up the ideal of liberty or freedom, these two terms are a bit different, but we don't have to get into that right now. Without giving up that ideal, a more egalitarian foundation had to be brought in as well. So instead of the cornerstone of liberty, now our Western democracies would have two cornerstones. Forced equality would be one cornerstone, and liberty would be other. Now, how can you do that? How can you have a society resting on a foundation of liberty and forced equality at the same time? Well, you do that by splitting the body politic into two bodies. You have a physical body of each individual citizen, and we'll give him every right you can possibly conceive of for his own physical body. But the other body will be the public body. So we're going to have a private body and a public body, no longer just a single political body. We'll divide it in two, and we'll insist on liberty of marijuana, liberty of sex, liberty of gay rights, liberty of abortion, liberty of divorce, liberty of you name it. I mean, everything which pertains to the individual's body and appetites is now freely accessible in most Western democracies. And they see it as real liberty. What they don't see is the hundreds of thousands of ways in which the state has inserted itself into their otherwise private lives, business lives, regulatory lives, and so on, coast to coast. In other words, if the government can provide something in an egalitarian way to every citizen, coast to coast, whatever, it will do that while leaving them free as individuals. Now, this is not perfect libertarianism, and it's not perfect socialism, but it's enough of both that I describe this new kind of country as libertarian socialist, because I think that's what we have today. We are so far beyond the old liberal democratic ideal, it's not even funny. When I was building my house here, I saw this every time I turned around. You needed a permit from the local municipality for every damn thing you wanted to do. And when they were building the fireplace in my living room, the workman came up and he said, well, this is where we're putting the mantle. You know, a big, huge, beautiful barn beam that I had for a mantle. I still have it. He said, this is where we're going to put it. And I said, no, I'd like it lower. It needs to be about 4 inches lower. No, he says, I can't do that. And I said, why? He said, government regulations. The mantle can only go has to go X number of inches above the hearth of the fireplace. I said, who said so? He said, the local municipality has bylaws about fireplace mantles. And of course, silly me, they had bylaws about everything. And I didn't realize that our contractor, every time he turned around, he was filing some new application to get permission for something that he needed permission for that I wasn't aware of. So libertarian socialism is the way we live now, and the Swedes like it. Most of them. They do have some disgruntled elements in the population, of course. Most of them either drop out or they leave, whatever. Sweden has enormous absentee rates and employee illness rates. I think something like 23 or 24 or 25 days a year are taken as sick leave by the average Swedish worker, and so on, paid, of course. And, these countries end up as what someone called client societies. The voters become clients of the state. Citizens are, for the most part, clients of a large group of public employees who take care of them throughout their lives. That is their job. The difference, by the way, and in Huntford's book, where he gives a couple of chapters on the actual ethnic and cultural background of the Swedes, you can see how this came out of their history, where they're less inclined to object to it than, say, we are, who are, than non-Swedes are. Popenow identifies four major ideologies that he says are responsible for family breakdown in Sweden. One of them, of course, is secularism. There is no God. It's all about Darwin, evolution theory, and materialism. So secularism rules in Swedish society, and if you were to start arguing otherwise, you would get laughed out of the classroom, or maybe laughed away from the family, well, I'm not going to say family dining table, because a lot of the Swedish homes, at least the group homes, do not include family dining tables. They have communal dining tables, where they try to basically force you to go eat with your neighbors, rather than just with your families. Why? Because if you're just eating with your family, oh boy, dad's going to tell his kids something about how he can get ahead, which implies that other kids won't get ahead, because not everybody can get ahead. Like he's going to picture the whole thing as a kind of race in which his family is engaged for success. And of course, this has been at the root of the Free West for hundreds of years. The idea of what I call a start line, I'm thinking of a race now, where the athletes get on the start line. It's been a start line philosophy. And the idea is that equality in the West, until these days, has always been same start line for everybody, same starting blocks for everybody, same starting gun. You all go when the gun goes off, and good luck to you, and may the best man win. Those are almost taboo words in a place like Sweden today. May the best man win. What about disadvantage? What about social pressures that made it difficult for him to run, or whatever? So what has happened in the West, and this is where libertarian socialism comes in, we now have a finish line philosophy. And the idea is to get everybody to the finish line together. And so in our schools in Canada now, for example, when the kids do go out and run or race, whatever, there's no medals for first or second or third place or anything like that. Everybody gets a ribbon just for finishing the run. And in other words, competition is getting knocked out of the kids' psyches at a very young age. Now, the very best ones, of course, who happen to be very fast runners or incredibly competitive and go get them, they just ignore all that, I suppose, and they do what they can until they get free of the grip of these institutions. But the thinking is there. And so Popenow said secularism is one of these ideologies. Radical feminism is the other one. And this is the greatest irony you can believe, because in the 19th century, when so many women and so many young children virtually had to leave the home, had to go work in the mines and the fields and the farms just to make enough money to get enough food to feed the family, that was considered a disaster. And 19th century feminists worked like crazy politically and in every other way to change the law so that children could go to school instead of going to work on the farms and in the mines, which is what they were doing. Maybe not all children, but an awful lot of them. So the radical feminists of the 19th century was very pro-family. These children need their mothers in the home. Let the man go out and do the hard work and bring in the bread. So what was the story on the scene when it came to wages? Well, the man who was married with 5 kids, he would go look for a job and he would say to the fellow hiring him, I need a family wage. I need enough to earn enough to support my family of 5, whatever. And so there was something then which was institutionalized and which was called a family wage. And without any fear of discrimination, any business in the 19th century knew about the family wage, and they forbade themselves to pay single males, for example, which mostly those who were coming after the women got back into the home, they would pay them less. If you were a single man like a bachelor, you might get half the pay of a man with a family of 5, and that was called the family wage. Some of us, like me, have argued we should bring that concept back, because this is how we perpetuate our society, how we keep it healthy, how we look after our children. And when we get to the chapter in this book on daycare, where you better be sitting down, we'll talk about, well, we talked about it in my chat on the traditional family system, okay? And one of the great features of the family system is family love, you see, which simply cannot be egalitarianized. And the example I think I gave last time, I'm going to give it again. I often give it to my more egalitarian friends. I do have some. And I say, look, if you were sitting on the beach and your kid was over there, 50 yards away shouting for help, and you knew that he was drowning, and he would drown if you didn't come and save him. And over here, there's a rubber raft that's going under, and there's 10 kids in it, and they're all strangers to you. You don't know any of them, but there's 10 of them, my goodness, and they're all going to drown because none of these kids can swim. What would you do? Any normal parent would say, well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to save my own child. I mean, it's an immediate feeling any natural parent would have of, I have to go save my own child. I'm so sorry about those 10 kids, but my kid is my kid. This is nature coming back on all fours, see? Dictating to us through these incredibly powerful feelings and attachments we have to our own people, that family is dominant. And that's why in my earlier talk, I said, so is family love. You see, it's the love of the child, the special love, which made him go get his child and save his child. And that's why if you go to a daycare center and you ask any of the workers there, where there's all kinds of kids, from different families, how will you treat my child? You know what they'll say? They'll give you the egalitarian answer. Very proudly, they will say, well, I'm going to treat your child just like any other child. Why would I treat them differently? And right away you get an insight into why egalitarian societies can't work. The kibbutz has never worked in Israel. Idealistic societies, which have been tried anywhere in the world on the basis of egalitarian love, simply can't work because it's not natural, you see. So when the daycare worker says, I'll treat your child like anyone else, the first instinct you have is, ooh, not my child. That's not how I treat my child. And that's why you don't want to leave your kid in a daycare center for too long. I think a little bit of it's fine. It's natural to socialize the child with other children. But you leave him there too long, and he's going to get the picture that he doesn't matter any more than anyone else does. Whereas the one thing a child really learns inside the natural family is that there's no one like him. There's no one who's got his mother or father's attention like he does. And that has some kind of incredibly powerful formative effect on the natural health of all human beings. And if they don't get it, they grow up warped. They grow up with something missing. They grow up angry and ready to lash out. In any case, they grow up incomplete. I'm not an expert in all that, but I can tell you, I think it's true. They end up incomplete because the legacy of family love has not been transmitted to them in the way that it should be. And so I get in trouble even with relatives who tell me their kid is going to daycare every day. I just shake my head. And I have to step up and say, hey, you be careful. Any more than like 20 hours a week, and you're probably asking for trouble. Not positive trouble in the sense that somebody's doing something to your child, but negative trouble in the sense that your child's not getting what he should be getting when he's in egalitarian daycare that long. Anyway,
I think that I think there are studies that demonstrate that kids that are staying away for more than 20 hours a week are developing mental problems, and they feel neglected almost.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very damaging for them. I'm wondering, in Sweden, they have a huge immigration, especially of Muslim families. Those policies of breaking apart the family are also applied to those Muslim families, or do they leave them alone?
I think probably, I don't know much about the Muslim families in Sweden, but I know that in France, for example, a lot of these Muslim neighborhoods are what they call no-go zones, where the police don't go, the government doesn't go. The Muslim community has created what's called an enclave. In sociology, they talk about enclaves, ethnic enclaves. Canada, for example, when I wrote The War Against the Family, our own government told us had about 6 ethnic enclaves in the country, places that were defined by their uniform ethnicity, which was not the traditional ethnicity of the country. The last report I saw, which was in 2006, so that's 15 years ago, told us that we had 265 enclaves. So what's happening in these countries is they're not replacing themselves through natural childbirth. Canada's so-called TFR, which is the total fertility rate, has been below 2.1 for 45 years. Well, if your TFR is below 2.1, you're not replacing yourself. Every woman has to have at least 2.1 children. Well, you can't have 0.1 of a child, but you know what I mean. It's a statistical number. If you don't have that many children per woman in your society, then you're losing population long term. And you are approaching what another American writer called Ben Wattenberg, he wrote a terrific book, also when my book came out, called The Birth Dearth. And it was about what's coming for Western societies which have not been replacing themselves. Well, one of the things that's been coming, of course, is mixed immigration. Immigration in Canada used to be more or less replacing the type of population that we had. Mostly white, mostly Western European people. Sure, some this, some that. There was sort of a multicultural pie, if you like. And we knew how many there were in each slice of the pie, kinds of people. And we tried to reflect that in our immigration. But then all of a sudden along came the modern thinking, which came out of the mouth of our own Prime Minister Trudeau also, He said, listen to this publicly, how he could say this, I don't know. He said, it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from. So it doesn't matter in terms of their history, their ethnicity, their color, their language, their value system, their religion. It doesn't? Please. Everybody knows that it does. And that's how cultures are formed. So in my book, The Trouble with Canada Still, in the chapter on multiculturalism, I try to distinguish between what I call deep culture and skin deep culture. Now, skin deep culture is about, okay, you drive a Volkswagen, you wear a suit made by so-and-so, you like Italian food, and you like Japanese sushi, and you like French movies, or whatever. That's all skin deep culture. And most people today, when they talk about culture, that's all they're talking about. And I know lots of people who will say, oh, it's wonderful. I drive down the street and there's a mosque over here and there's a Jewish temple over there and there's a Christian church a little farther along and there's an Italian grocery store and a French clothing shop, and on they go and on they go. Isn't this wonderful? It's almost like now I don't have to go to Europe. I can get it all here. But what they're not looking at is the deep culture. The deep culture has to do with your political system. And the big question there, of course, is to what extent does individual liberty play a part in your political system? What role does property rights play in your political system and all these kind of things. It's about the religious basis. What view of God does your citizenry have? What's the relationship of the citizen to God? What's the idea they have of God? The Muslim view of God, for example, is incredibly different from the Christian view. I don't want to go too far into that, but I've done some work and writing about it. And the Muslim view of God basically is that God is a God of pure will. We had that view too in the 16th and 17th centuries when William of Ockham and people like that were writing about nominalism. And the whole idea was that God cannot be limited. You can't limit God by saying what he's like. You can't call him a God of love or a God of anything else. That's blasphemy. Are you trying to put ideas in the mind of God? How dare you? And so on. So you can understand why they say what they say. But what they're basically saying is God is a God of pure will. And we have nothing to do with God, what God wants. If he wants 2 + 2 to equal 5 tomorrow, he can do it. If he wants to make evil good and good evil, he can do it. Who are you to say that he can't? So, but that's a very different view than the Christian view, from Jesus forward at least. God is the God of love, and so on. Well, we know, I don't go into all that now, but it's a very different notion of, in the Christian view, God can do no evil. In the Muslim view, he can do whatever he wants. It's not up to you. In the Christian view, it's impossible. The definition of God is love. That's part of who he is, and so on, you see. So when Trudeau said it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from, I think he was very wrong. He was fantastically wrong. Crazy how much it matters where they come from. And these are just some of the examples. Same with language. Language is incredibly formative of how it is that people feel about their life, their culture, their friends, their whole society. A lot of this is rooted in the language that they learned as a young child. I remember when I was a professor at York University, some of my students would come in after I graded their essays, and I could always tell the ones who were bilingual or multilingual. And they would sit down and I would say, "Is English your second language?" I mean, they were very good at writing anyway, even in English. And they would say, "Yes, how did you know?" I said, "Well, I can tell because of the syntax and the way you structure some of your sentences. What was your first language?" And then we get into a discussion and all that. But all of these things, language, religion, cultural values, the political values, I mean, if you're welcoming people into your society that have no interest in what we used to call liberal democracy, right, and think it's actually a bad system and would like to see a unitary theocracy running your country, you got problems because, there's 9 seats on the municipal board where you live, and 5 of them are Islamists, or Muslims rather. I think of an Islamist as someone who's very radical. Muslim may not be radical at all, they may be nominal, but they do have different values than the ones you grew up with. And they're on the municipal board. And so when there's a vacant lot down the street and everyone's trying to decide what should go in the vacant lot, what permission should be given for what, the Muslims might say, "What about a mosque?" And the Christians on the board, who are now outnumbered, they say, "I don't think we should have a mosque. This is not a Muslim society." "Oh, yeah, but it is now." That kind of thing. So I think a lot more care has to be taken in these respects, and that the West is in for a terrible surprise when the birth dearth, which has already begun. I'm part of it at 81. I'm going to go eventually. And part of the birth dearth, the post-war baby boom, boy, I mean, when that happens, I think a population center at, don't know whether it was Yale or another university, where they have a worldwide population center, they basically predicted that a country like Italy, which has around 60 million people today, that around the year 2080, it would have 35 or 40 million. In other words, millions of people would be gone, and they simply cannot be replaced with sufficient speed through immigration, even dislocating immigration, which is what we're talking about. It's very dislocating. And even then, you can't replace those millions and millions of people. So what are you going to have? All kinds of storefront operations which can't be leased because there's no one there to lease them. Apartments that are 25% empty, apartment buildings, 25% empty, office towers. I mean, it's crazy. So the West is going to have to get, I'm going to say totalitarian about birth rates. It's going to have to get very involved in making home life and maternal life incredibly attractive once again, just like we did in the 19th century. So isn't it strange how it's all going to go in a circle?
Yeah. It's very interesting to see that also in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, they changed the immigration laws in the year of 1964, and they stopped the immigration from white Europe, and they basically allowed any other incompatible culture and country. And I honestly believe that it's all designed, that this multiculturalism is eventually an invitation for the destruction of, you know, the beautiful things that you mentioned earlier, those deeper culture.
It is, and that's what Trudeau Sr. wanted to do. However, if there's any sense in which we want to salvage him as a decent person, it would be this. I think he was a good person, and I say this about my liberal friends. I say liberals are not bad people. They're good people with bad ideas. And Prime Minister Trudeau had bad ideas. And one of them was incredibly idealistic notion that all mankind is the same. Your language, your color, your politics, your faith, none of that matters. All that matters is that you're a human being. And in that respect, you're just like me and just like everybody else. So it was kind of a baseline notion that that's all that matters. But as I say, I don't think it's true. I think people feel very powerfully about their deep culture. For example, in Canada, a French-speaking Quebecer and an English-speaking Canadian may not have much to do with each other here in Canada. But if they go to war and they're both in the Canadian Army, believe me, they're buddies. They're buddies fighting the enemy, and they're both proud to fight for Canada. You know, the differences disappear when you get down to the common cultural aspects of their lives. Mm-hmm. So I do believe it's been a mistake, like you. Multiculturalism has been a mistake. And I'm afraid to say it's almost too late now.
What do you feel about a good man with a bad idea who is actually applying his bad idea? Is he still a good man?
Well, I don't think he was aware that it was a bad idea. And I would encourage any of your listeners to this program to dig up my article in Epoch Times, and you'll get a feeling for why he thought the way he did about this country, for example. What it was that, you know, his Trudeau Sr.'s motto was le raison avant la passion. So reason before passion, or reason above passion. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Cartesian thinker. Reason was everything. And he felt that was his guide. Excuse me. His guide. And so reason told him that all human beings are human beings. Everything else is artificial. They can cope with that. And I agree with him that skin deep culture is artificial, but deep culture is not. It's profoundly formative. And he didn't pay enough attention to that. So he was blind, you might say. I don't think he was an evil man. He was smart. He was tough. But ideologically speaking, he was in a Cartesian's straitjacket. And in my article in Epoch Times, again, it's called The Charter at 40, numerals 440. You can probably find it online. You'll see that article explains how the Cartesian imperative shaped his thinking and therefore reshaped Canada, changed it from what it was into what it is today. One man, basically. I think we're done now.
Yes. Thank you very much, William. Thank you for this amazing and important information. would you like me to see if there is any question, or we will just meet next Wednesday?
I'm afraid I'm being called.
No problem.
I'm being called to downstairs. I probably should go. It's been a bit long today.
Yes. So thank you very much for coming, and we will see you next Wednesday as usual.
Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
Of course. Have a beautiful evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye for now.